Really, really excited to be back here today for another FinTech Forward AFC webinar. Today is a really exciting day, mostly because I get to be here with some of my favorite people. Now, I will say they weren't always my favorite people, but just preparing for this, gotten to know each of them and really appreciate what they each bring to this conversation. I always introduce myself, but given this topic, right, I could say I'm Phil Goldfeder and I'm the CEO of the American FinTech Council. But is this the real me? And do you really trust and believe it's the real me? Are these the real them? And is it the real them? And that's really what we're going to dig into today. How do you know what is a deep fake? What is it not? And more importantly, what are the real world implications to people utilizing this technology? Obviously, both for the good and unfortunately, sadly, as we've seen, for the bad. And so really excited to be here with all of you, and more importantly, with our guest today to talk about it. Nick, we'll start with you. If you can introduce yourself.
Hey everyone, I'm Nick Farnsworth. I'm a partner at Oric, specializing in privacy, security, and advanced technologies with a particular focus on biometrics and artificial intelligence these days. I advise clients across industries on their data and technology strategies generally and what to do when things go wrong, both from a regulatory perspective as well as interacting with their customers and partners.
That is, Nick, I'm always curious when you sort of jump into this specialty. Maybe we'll build this in later, but I mean, you really dug deep in terms of expertise, subject matter expertise. Sorry, folks, I'm interrupting introduction. How does one, as the evolving technologies come out, right, do you find yourself getting into those things?
Yeah, so I mean, I got really lucky early on in my career that we were working with a number of large artificial intelligence developers who were trying to stay in front of what was happening with the regulations. And it gave me an opportunity to really dig deep in what the technology looked like and how it was being developed and how it was anticipated to be used. And to really also get a chance then to see how the legal landscape was developing. And so that allowed me to just have so many conversations with different folks in the community and really learn from them as to what was happening, particularly in an area where the law is not well established and you can't just rely on court precedent and what the law says today to be able to become a trusted advisor to a lot of these companies on these issues.
Love it. Thank you so much for being here today. Maxine?
Hi, everybody. I'm Maxine Most. You can see three logos next to my head. My main company is a company called Acuity Market Intelligence, and we're a strategic advisory and analyst firm, been around biometrics and digital identity amazingly for 25 years now. And then more recently created an initiative called the Prism Project, which is like a market education at scale program designed to help folks that are not experts in biometrics and digital identity have enough information to understand it and make intelligent decisions about it. We just published a report on financial services. Whole idea is for practitioners who need to know enough to have good, smart conversations and ask people like Nick intelligent questions. And then finally, the Deepfake Summit, that's that square on the bottom. Part of the motivation for me being here today is we're actually doing an event, a live event, on September 1st in Washington, D.C., that's going to bring together folks from across the entire ecosystem, practitioners, vendors, legal experts, policy, governance, and have some conversations about how to build an ecosystem of trust to address what you were saying, Phil, which is like, how do you know anybody is who they say they are, not only online, but even in person these days? So really excited to be here and have an interesting conversation about where we are and where the threat levels are and what we can do to start addressing them.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Maxine. Damien, last, certainly not least.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me. My name is Damian Schwartz. I work for Kaufman Rawson. I've been here a little over 3 years now. I'm the director of cyber digital forensics and incident response. But prior to that, I was a United States Secret Service agent for about 26 years. I retired out. I ran their electronic crimes task force out of the New York field office and their mobile wireless tracking team. So I've been in physical and investigative roles for well over 30 years now.
I absolutely love that. As Denise and our team has said, if anybody has any questions for any of our panelists, feel free to put it in the chat. I will continue to monitor that and ask them in real time. All right, Damien, that background and sort of it makes it easy to sort of get us kicked off, right? So you spent more than 20 years in the Secret Service, right? My guess is in the time that you were there, the way in which threats and fraud evolved was fairly significant, right? And then since you've left, right, the threat
Mhm.
continues to evolve to where we are today. How, again, maybe sort of the same way in which Nick sort of thought about his specialty, how did you think about staying on top of those evolving threats?
Well, I always say that the threats and the fraud schemes are always the same. The underlying issues are always the same. They always have been the same. When I first got to New York, we had a big Nigerian scam going on. It was the 419 scam. But that just evolved from like the Roman days where it was on a note and then it went to, letters and then it went to email. So the fraud schemes have remained the same throughout the years. It's now the delivery system that we're seeing. And this delivery system is outpacing anything that we can imagine. It's evolving so fast with the technology.
Nick, you obviously spent a lot of your times on the legal side, sort of advising companies. Again, to what Damien just described, I know while simplistic when you think about it, right? It's simplistic in terms of what the problem is. When you talk about the actual implications of how people are utilizing it and then ultimately consumers are being harmed, how do you advise companies with, that sort of such a big problem? How do you advise companies with such an evolving threat risk and sort of technology, evolving so quickly?
It's a great question. So it is difficult if you look at it at a macro level to really get your arms around it. There's just so many different ways that these technologies can be used to implicate your company. So what we often do is we talk with companies to really think about where are the various touch points where this type of technology can cause you troubles and almost map that out, right? Where are you interacting with people face to face? Where are you asking for static images of IDs? Or where might you be communicating with them verbally? Where you might use the familiarity with someone or potentially their biometrics itself to make determinations as to who that person is. And by mapping it out, we can then think about what are the downstream implications if something goes wrong in that particular touch point and we trust the wrong individual to really drill in on the spaces where it matters most and where the impact may be most significant. And oftentimes when we go through that process, I do find companies are sometimes surprised as to which ones they didn't think of are the potential avenues where these types of technologies can cause them real trouble.
If I could just jump in for a second,
Please.
what both Nick and Damien are talking about really is what we refer to as the industrialization of fraud, right? I mean, it used to be these were relatively difficult or complex attacks, whether they, be kind of more the historical type of attacks that Damien was talking about, or the AI driven attacks we're seeing today. It used to take quite a bit of effort, some know-how, some intelligence. You had to be a really good scammer. You had to be a con person. You had to be able to figure all that. Now, anybody can basically sit at their computer and with very little effort and cost, basically zero cost, can create these attacks and these scams. And so that's really, I think, the dynamic that's changed significantly. And it's why every organization, regardless of size, it's not just big, Fortune 500 enterprises that are getting attacked. Every organization is susceptible to these attacks. And, it's just as easy now to steal $1,000 from a million people as it is to steal $1 million from 1,000 people. And so that changes the nature of the threat landscape. Every organization has to be worried about this. And it's not just your customers or your clients, it's also internally. You have to be worried about it, right? We've seen amazing increases in hiring fraud. So it's everywhere all the time, all at once. And I think that's really kind of the problem. It's just very overwhelming right now. And so, as Nick said, kind of identifying the key vulnerabilities is really critically important.
And AI has changed the game so much because now, we used to have these cyber criminals sitting offshore in foreign countries. They were very technical people, have a tremendous amount of education, but they can't find work, so they start, dealing in the criminal enterprises. Now you have, I don't even want to say they're script kiddies because you could literally go to AI. AI will write the code for you. You have to have zero knowledge. But the other problem is if you don't have the knowledge, you can buy or rent tools from cyber criminals who have already created these tools. And then once you deploy their tools, you just pay back a part of the ransom or whatever you get as a rental fee. So it's making it very easy so you don't have to be as technical to perform these large scale cyber attacks.
Yeah, fraud is a service.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen it with the ransomware cases where the same company was getting hit multiple times, and this happened more with more than one case that we worked on, and they had different types of signatures for the ransomware, and we were just thinking, all right, these cyber criminals, like you don't pay on this one, we'll get you to pay on this one, but it was different criminals coming in because they were renting the tools, and this was a high value target, so to speak.
Do you guys think when it comes specifically when it comes to financial services, there's a different level of expectations for consumers, right? And maybe Nick, I'll start with you on this, right? And I think about this all the time. We run the American Fintech Council, right? Innovative companies are changing the way consumers are accessing financial services, which there's a little bit of a mind shift, right? Because I think historically you saw big bank branches with these huge marble pillars, right? As a show of strength, right? Right. Your money is safe. And this is all, it stems back from, the Great Depression. That obviously has shifted significantly over the years. Where we are today, right? Understanding how deepfakes, how AI, how fraud is impacting financial services specifically. How do you make companies obviously help them make their consumers feel safer?
Yeah, it is a great question. And I will say that trust factor is one of the biggest things in financial services that stands out from a lot of other areas, right? Because you are asking people to hand you some of the most important things in their lives, their money and their assets. When it comes to developing that trust, there's a couple of things that companies need to think in mind, and particularly in the financial services space. The first is that the biggest thing to protect that trust is really trying the best you absolutely can to prevent the real incidents from occurring. Because that is the quickest way that trust gets eroded. When data breaches occur and accounts are lost or assets are lost and it gets into the news, it is very difficult, no matter what you say about your procedures and what you have put in place, to try to convince a customer that they can trust you again. So trying to limit and prevent to the extent that you can things from escalating and going into a poor direction is maybe the most important. From there, it is really one of those things where like trust almost has to be built in a way that is not, it is a push and pull with the customer experience. Because every time we add a new authentication point and an additional hurdle for you to get into your account, it might make the customer feel a little bit safer, but it also makes them feel incredibly frustrated that they have to jump through hoops to get to where they need to be. So oftentimes when I'm talking to companies about this, what we have to think through is when I call in as a customer, I should feel pretty good that you're asking the right questions to make me feel comfortable that you're making sure I am who I am, but I'm not having to jump through every hoop in the world. And there should be sort of an escalation as to how important is the thing I'm asking for that determines how many steps and hoops I have to jump through to get there. And sort of that friction that a customer feels about barriers being put in their way doesn't feel as bad and actually helps to build trust if it's something that they feel is very, very important that could impact them in the long run.
Again, we spent a lot of time thinking about how do you speed up payments? How do you speed up payments, right? You saw that over the years, sort of the evolution of money moving quicker. And then all of a sudden it was a whoa, whoa, whoa. How do we build more friction into that process? When I think about when I use Zelle, right? Or Venmo, where now Zelle, there's probably two or three different questions like, do you know this person? What is it for? Right. There's a number of questions that are now built in. I think, Nick, you hit it right on the head, right? Like, what is the right amount that makes me feel good, but doesn't make me say, forget it. I'm just going to find some other way to pay this bill. Maxine, you have really, you've built sort of the Deepfake Summit, right? And so you are really you get to see up close and personal kind of the trends that are happening. Do you see people taking this thing, the concept of deepfakes and fraud more serious in financial services than maybe other industries?
Well, yeah, I think people are, acutely aware of this because we're seeing it all the time on every video screen we look at, and one comment just on the point that you and Nick were talking about in terms of friction, right? I've always said when people started talking about frictionless payments and frictionless financial services, I was like, it's not friction. We don't want frictionless. We want the appropriate level of friction for the risk and the value of the transaction. And as you add things like deep fakes and synthetic identities and agentic AI, and we've now seen agentic AI escape its boundaries and do its own thing without anybody asking it to and breaking through systems, right? The question is, what are you trying to do? And do you have permission to do that? And oh, are you the right person? And so, you can add these verification authentication steps. You can add step up authentication where people have to do more things. But if consumers and citizens aren't confident that that their data, that their information, that their financial resources are only accessible to them and they can't be cheated out of them by somebody, pretending to be them, then, that really diminishes the trust that people have in organizations. And so what we're seeing in the Deepfake Summit, is bringing people together. And yes, this is really, there's a lot of it that's around payments and financial services, but this is around government entities and it's around energy companies and healthcare companies, anybody that has sensitive information. And it all relates back to finances because at the end of the day, your personal records that any of these type of organizations hold can be used to develop either deepfake you or develop synthetic identities that have part of your information in it, and they can gain access to your information, and that gives them access to your financial assets. So a lot of this, going back to what Damien said, there's two primary reasons people do this, right? For financial gain or to commit different kinds of criminal activity, which can be, hurting people, reputational or damaging companies. But that's really 90% of this stuff is driven around moving money around, illicitly or covering money movements that people don't want to find out about or gaining access to accounts. And so I think that the trust factor of, that I think banks have had for a long time. And even as we've, through the pandemic in particular, created all these like remote automated ways to access our resources. Now these threats of deepfakes and synthetic identity and AI, people are getting scared. And that's not good for anybody. It's not good for the organizations. It's not good for the financial institutions. It's not good for citizens, consumers. It's not good for the government. So the question is, how do we really build not just trust in an individual organization, but an ecosystem of trust where people feel comfortable interacting and doing all the things that they have to do to function in a civil society?
So we're gonna get into the regulatory, maybe the more legal piece of this, and Nick, I'm gonna come back to you. But Damien, let me ask you this question, right? Because again, as a consumer myself, right, I demand certain things, and we've been talking about this concept of friction points, but ultimately, as a consumer, I'm demanding that my financial services providers are getting me my products faster, quicker. But ultimately, sort of what's the balance there, right? What is the right balance between the consumers who's demanding that access and the companies who have a responsibility to ensure that they're protecting those assets? Did we lose you, Damien?
He went away.
All right, Nick. Maybe.
Nope.
Oh, there he's back.
My screen froze up. I'm sorry. I apologize. My screen froze up for some reason. I heard part of your question, but I want to pose another question back as
Please.
part of my answer is, and I see this all the time because we get called in from both sides. We get called in by victims that have been compromised, but we also have represented banks. What happens when the bank has everything in place that they are required to have? And sometimes we've gone above and beyond. But the consumer is sloppy with their data. The consumer does not protect themselves. They get breached and now they want to push it back on the bank.
We're having some technical difficulties.
Yeah.
Nick, maybe I'll go. That's the perfect segue, Nick. What's the legal take here? Now, I don't need you to tell me chapter and verse, right? Contracts, not, but like fundamentally, whose responsibility is it? Who should be driving that conversation?
It's a really great question, and some of the responsibility allocation will depend on the entity that is involved and what laws they're ultimately subject to. But in most jurisdictions and most industries, the general rule is that the financial services company is responsible for implementing what is referred to as reasonable security measures and reasonable authentication measures. The law smartly typically realizes that it could not possibly amend itself to create a set standard that can be met with certainty as these threats are evolving. So they usually will say you have to have reasonable security measures, reasonable authentication measures that are designed and take into account the risks that exist in the market today. Sometimes they'll point to other things like industry standards, NIST standards as a good way to sort of pull in what others are doing. But it is not just written into the law that if you do X, you are fine and you are safe. So when something ultimately does go wrong, typically the fight that ends up happening is whoever was harmed points to the financial service and says, you didn't do enough. Whatever
Mhm.
you thought you had put in place wasn't enough to obviously protect what happened. And that gives them a posture to be able to say it wasn't reasonable. You didn't put in enough effort. And it becomes the financial services group's obligation and responsibility to fight back and say, yet we can't possibly address every risk that could ever happen. What we did was reasonable. It was designed to address the risks as we saw them, taking into account available resources and ultimately what we saw. At the end of the day, it's a real hard determination as to who is responsible. If most of the time, if the bank service and the financial service does what they were supposed to and put in enough measures that it would reasonably be designed to prevent most of the harms, they theoretically should not be held liable. There's some nuance to that, particularly for fraudulent like wire transfers and unauthorized transactions, where if the consumer reports a transaction in enough time, the financial service can ultimately be held on sort of on the hook for it because they should be able to unwind it if they essentially acted on the report in a sufficient amount of time. But if the financial service did the reasonable thing, they should not be held responsible. Now, the real challenge with that, though, is when you get into a court, when you get in front of people, the facts now are totally different than when we were just working from abstract, right? And you are seeing a breach or a unauthorized transaction that has actually happened, and then it starts to become harder to determine sort of retrospectively, was it reasonable for them to not think of this risk or not implement this one particular measure? We'll often see fights around things like, well, if you had just paid another $10,000, you could have implemented this thing, but it wasn't a threat that they had realized at the time may be likely to materialize. So that's usually how the law breaks it down and where it's allocated.
Nick, so firstly, I hate that word reasonable. I mean, I love the word, hate the way it's used here because ultimately it comes back down to the individual, how you think about the word. Let me ask you, just take this maybe one step deeper, right? The American Fintech Council represents both fintech companies and innovative banks who are oftentimes partnering together. How do you think about the responsibility on the industry side when you have, two parties, three parties, four parties that are coming together to offer the super product?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a real challenge. The law does not typically allocate responsibility amongst the various parties. That they usually rely on sort of the commercial arrangement between the parties to think about it. And we saw this for a long time, right, with the large data aggregators who want to pull together information from lots of different banks. And there was a big fight for a long time of banks saying, like, I don't want to give this information downstream to them because they're startups. I have no idea if they have the right security in relation to the measures. Ultimately, the customers tend to win out in terms of what they want, and people will figure out a way to go about it. Um, we have seen financial institutions try to put some responsibility on the particular user. I, for myself, oftentimes will use those aggregating services, and my bank will serve me a big notice that says anything that goes wrong is entirely in your hands, and we don't recommend you use this tool. Similar things happen when we start to collaborate as an industry to talk through as we are pulling authentication out of the main sort of service, or we're relying on multiple parties to act together to make sure that we have come up together with a technical approach that is sound and makes sense. And the lawyers in the background are working to put together a legal framework that says in a contract, if something goes wrong, who is ultimately responsible?
Well, and at the end of the day,
Okay,
too,
next.
just at the end of the day, too, right? Like, what happens with consumers, I just had an experience like this, with a organization where they were trying to tell me what went wrong, and I'm like, I don't care. Like, I'm not interested in what went wrong, why it didn't work or what practices you did and didn't use, right? Like, I have an issue. I lost value, I lost money, I didn't get a repair I was supposed to get, whatever it is, so the challenge, I think, in a lot of ways is, it comes back to what Nick was saying about, banks being trusted sources. There's a reputational issue here as well that is really critical, because if we don't trust the banks, who do we trust? I think that that there's the practical reality, there's a legal framework, there's the sort of what's reasonable. I agree with you, I hate that word. And then there's the experience that your customers have and what they think of your institution, and that as a strategic marketer, you know the value or the loss of value based on those kind of things can be far outweigh being right in court.
Damien, we're going to talk about the technology in a second, but sort of I want you to opine on that same question, right? Because you deal with all kinds, as you mentioned, you're sometimes dealing with consumers who have concerns, you deal with companies who have concerns, but financial services has gotten more complicated from the industry offering, as I mentioned, right? There's partnerships on multiple levels, right? Banks are embracing. We just announced a new member today who's in the regulatory space that helps utilizing AI to oversee sort of marketing materials and marketing reviews. There's so many pieces of the pie that are helping the financial services providers, make sure they're doing it the right way. And so, how do you think about ultimately where the responsibility could lie, and who should be thinking about it? And forget responsibility. Who should be staying up at night to ensure they're thinking about those protections?
I think everybody should be thinking about it.
Is it you?
I think everybody should be thinking about it, because when I go out and talk to these banks and I talk to everybody, I say security is everybody's problem.
Yep.
The person that's sitting behind that desk and works on that computer program for 30 years, they're your best source of information. So everybody needs to be thinking about it. But at the end of the day, I've gone into some of the largest banks when there's been issues as a Secret Service agent, and you're like, oh, this should be a cakewalk. Their stuff's going to be on point. And half their stuff is held together with duct tape. Like it's horrible, because they're using legacy systems. They're trying to keep them running as long as possible, because an upgrade is almost impossible to do an upgrade. So, it's very hard. But at the end of the day, I think everybody from the bottom up needs to be thinking about this, because everybody could be a point of failure. And we always say, the cyber criminals only have to be right once. And it could be something as easy as an email that could take down an entire system. Whereas the bank, you have to be right 100% of the time. Missing that one thing is 100% failure for you.
I absolutely love that answer. We didn't prep that question, but I think that was as perfect an answer. I think we ran into trouble over the last number of years where there's a question about whose responsibility was it? And you found a lot of this, right? Like this is the pathway forward. You're seeing that more and more with responsible fintech companies, innovative banks. I think everybody is taking on that responsibility. I was just mentioning to someone this morning, you're finding more fintech companies that have chief risk and chief compliance officers, because they recognize they have to be just as vigilant as their bank partners do, right? To ensure they're getting it right 100% of the time. So let's talk about this, right? I mentioned
real quick. Can I just
mention
something real quick on that?
Yeah.
Note? In the Secret Service, I was part of the United Nations General Assembly every single year. Every year, because there were so many moving parts, we did tabletop exercises. That is a valuable tool for any organization. I don't care what your size, because everybody thinks they're locked up like Fort Knox. But when you put them in a room and you start running scenarios, you get a lot of the finger pointing. And this way you see how well communication is flowing. You see how well the things that you implemented, people even know their jobs. I tell everybody, you need to know the job above you and the job below you, because when a problem happens, I guarantee that person that you're relying on for your information is out of the equation. So I really think that's a valuable tool to test what you have in place and see what you're getting if it's going to hold up under duress.
Damien, you answered the question I was going to ask. I give you all the credit in the world. No, very simply in that, I talked about, we have new companies that are joining the American Fintech Council every day who are creating AI tools to combat fraud and abuse, right? That's what they're doing. Yeah. But the fraudsters are doing the same thing, right? And so how do you actually make sure when push comes to shove that the right tools are in place to protect? Maxine, sorry, go ahead.
So, because it's really interesting. Because one of the things that came up at our first Deepfake Summit in Houston, and we're going to be talking about this in DC too, is this notion of how organizational silos actually prevent companies from building comprehensive fraud solutions, particularly this AI-driven impersonation fraud. And the notion that the way that we have structured enterprises, and I've been having this conversation recently with a lot of people, and it's kind of a pretty bold way of thinking about this, but I think we're going to have to rethink the way we structure enterprise. I think this idea that we have these different silos in the organization and everybody has their little domain that they operate in is not functional in a world where fraudsters have access to evolving a technology that is evolving so quickly and that we're constantly running to keep up with. I used to call it an arms race. Now I call it trench warfare because we're literally fighting over a couple of inches or feet in terms of the capabilities of the technology. And so one of the things that's come up is this notion of not just having, sort of tiger teams to address these as one-off situations, but having cross-functional for now anyway, cross-functional teams that are literally integrated into the organization so that, you're not just getting it together once a year or once a quarter. You're like basically on a regular, weekly, near daily basis, having those conversations and sharing that information. And I fundamentally think we're going to have to come up with new structures for enterprises, which is kind of radically different than what we've had. But I think what we have continues to keep us vulnerable to these very sophisticated attacks. And one of the, I was at a conference, I think you were there too, Phil, a Safeguard
Yep.
in Denver. And one of the things that came up was talking about how so many databases in financial services already have synthetic identities in them. They already have these identities that are sitting there building credit scores. And I was talking to someone, they're like, oh, we don't have any of those in our database. And I'm like, how do you know? And that's, I think, part of the problem is deep fakes and synthetic identities. This stuff is already out there in operating within the ecosystem as it exists today. And one of the things that's interesting about the way these accounts work is they tend to build up credibility and credit scores over time to get to the point where they can then go create a very sophisticated high value attack. So they're just sitting there in the background, waiting. And you could have, hundreds or thousands of these, and you can build coordinated attacks. I mean, it is really devastating. And so it's not just, the front door and preventing things from coming in. It's also what technology capabilities do we have? And I'm sure you're seeing this in your organization at AFC. We're seeing this across the landscape where organizations are coming in saying, oh, no, what we do is we go look at your existing database and
Yeah,
track it and
Maxine,
figure out what's in there.
you and Damien both hit on something, and Nick, I'd be curious to hear your experience on this front specifically. Has there been an evolution? My guess is when it comes to outside counsel, they generally interact with general counsels of companies or legal teams within a company. Have you seen any form of evolution where you find yourself talking to operations teams or compliance teams or sort of deeper in, or even technology teams within the organization to make them aware? Or do you find that you still are going through legal offices? Like how has your engagement with your clients changed over the year?
I would say it is much more focused on the operations and technical teams today than it is solely on the legal front, because those are the folks who are on the front lines of trying to deal with these risks. And candidly, a lot of it is having conversations with them as well about really understanding what the risk is when we talk about deepfakes, because everyone is familiar with different versions of these types of attacks, right? People are very familiar with the idea of someone trying to use a deepfake to authenticate to a customer's account. But they might be less familiar with the idea that a lot of people are now using these deepfakes for really personalized phishing activities, trying to go behind the scenes, not through some of your stronger authentication walls that maybe have a really good process in place, but going to an individual on a specific team who has the ability behind the scenes with an authenticated account to make changes, potentially just within the security system itself and not even directly focused on a particular individual's account. And so we do a lot of activity these days, talking with the operations folks to understand what they're doing, where the various components within the organization live, where there might be weak points, and doing a lot of efforts these days to sort of upscale some of the training that is happening. If you've been relying on phishing training that existed 5 or 6 years ago, a lot of times you'll look at those hints and tips that are like, look for spelling issues and grammatical concerns. Well, those don't exist anymore, right? Like that is not what you need to be looking for in the same way. And so really giving people those tools and having those conversations with everyone who needs to be involved around what are these attacks looking like? And are there things that we can be looking for to identify them before they get to a place where it causes real harm?
Damien, I've gotten to know sort of people throughout Kaufman Rawson. I've enjoyed, Kaufman was actually one of our earliest strategic partners here at the American Fintech Council. I kind of want to ask you the same question in terms of how do you guys think about your engagement with members, whether they're banks or fintech companies, the level of expertise, right? Like, do you find that, again, you're finding more general counsels have more technical expertise. You're finding more operational people have more technical expertise. I remember a time where, the IT department would tell sort of the banking folks or the operational folks, don't worry, we've built the system, right? And everybody kind of took everybody at their word. So I don't think that's really the case anymore, given some of the incidents we've had.
It definitely, from what I'm seeing now, is definitely not the case. And getting back to what was said earlier by Maxine, is the silos. We see a lot of the siloed out effect where the left hand doesn't even realize it has a right hand. And that's a big problem. So when we go in and we do our tabletops with them, we're seeing that, they're not talking to one another. So I like to use the task force mentality. There is no silos. It's one giant task force. Everybody has their own specialty, but that specialty can cross into other groups because we're seeing companies are buying multiple tools, but they're similar in nature and they don't even realize two different departments are running. We've had situations where they're running tools that are freeware and IT doesn't even know about it, and it's tied back to a critical piece of software that could take down the entire company. So if it did, they wouldn't even be able to fix it because they didn't know about it. So we need to kind of break down the silos. We need to work on people's expertise and kind of take them out of their role and say, okay, you're legal. Well, if you're legal with a very strong cyber background, you should be partnering up with the IT department, and it should be collaborative.
Nick, I'm going to come back to you now, maybe to shift this conversation a bit. And Maxine, get ready because I'm coming to you next. Talk to me about, again, we talked about responsibility between the consumer and the company that's offering the product. Where does the regulatory sort of structure fit in here, right? Where do you think sort of regulation and again, impossible, we think about the AI, the activities on the regulatory front around AI and how do we regulate it? And I've seen state legislators opine and state attorneys general opine, and obviously we've seen the federal government step in and try to start thinking about AI. I would argue regulation tends to be a step behind industry, but what is the responsibility of regulators, of the regulatory entity and structure in terms of making sure that consumers are safe?
It's a great question. So, and it does vary a little bit as we go through administration in terms of how much strength different regulators are ultimately given. But for the most part, historically, the way that it has come about is that the regulators are designed to try to be empowered, primarily to be used as an enforcement mechanism to try to shape industry practice. Right? It's impossible for them to actually go out and inspect and audit every single financial services or fintech company's actual practices. So a lot of times what they are thinking about doing is providing guidelines, setting standards by enforcing against people who are not meeting the standard that they expect to be there, and helping both the entire community, right? Both the customers and the folks who are actually providing the services understand what those threats look like. And so we've seen a big uptick in this over the last couple of years. FinCEN, who's the Financial Crimes and Enforcement Network, has done a few different alerts on deepfakes and really outlining for financial institutions what that threat looks like and what their responsibilities are in identifying red flags that might trigger the idea that a deepfake is being used. Some of those alerts kind of living in the background too, not solely relying on a biometric tool to try to identify if an image that you're looking at is really who they say they are, but looking at other indicators of things like, are the IP addresses coming from a geography that makes sense? Or is the transaction timing seeming odd for a normal type of customer? So we often see regulators providing that level of guidance. The New York Department of Financial Services has provided similar guidelines as well. And those regulators oftentimes are engaging with the market to get a sense of what people are seeing, to be able to disseminate some of that knowledge. And it does tend to lead towards updates to frameworks. NIST SP 863 was updated not long ago to try to really incorporate some of these ideas around controls for addressing injection attacks and forged media, which are the deepfakes of the world. So regulators definitely play a role, but we can't expect them to be doing everything in the market because there's only so many limited resources for what they can actually do.
Maxine?
So, there's so many things that Nick just said that I want to respond to. I'm trying to organize it in my brain. One of the things that I think is really important is, and you mentioned the NIST standard. I think it's a lot of focus more on outcomes and actually prescribing specific technologies. And I think that's really important because this is an ecosystem where the fraudsters have no limits and have no bounds and are going to keep innovating at an incredible scale. And I sort of have this visual image. Sort of you have the institutions and the enterprises, whether it's government or financial services, are kind of running like this. And then you have the fraudsters and the technology are running at this speed. And there's a real disconnect between those two operational realities. And so you have to have some guidelines. You also have to leave the innovators the space to go do their innovation. And, so I think that's really critically important. And the other thing that Nick said that I think is also critically important is this idea of risk signals, right? This is not about like, okay, we're just protecting the front door. We're just protecting certain access points. We have, and there are obviously, and I'm sure again, lots of members of the AFC that are operating in this space where they're looking at what we call continuous monitoring and continuous authentication and providing constant risk signal measurements so that it's not just an access point. It's an ongoing assessment of the behavior that we're seeing inside of an enterprise and understanding where that behavior might be fraudulent. And going back to what I said earlier about having synthetic identities already inside or deepfakes already inside of your system, that's a place where those things can be recognized, right? And I think that is so important. And it's also, again, why it's so important to be bringing together the regulators, the privacy people, the innovators, the financial services organizations, right? This is an ecosystem problem that no single organization can, or no single entity can solve on their own, whether it's through dictates or regulations or a specific technology, right? We have to collaborate in a way that's going to build this trusted infrastructure, and that it's not a problem to solve. It is an ongoing condition that we're all going to have to participate in.
I love
Yeah.
that. Love that answer. Damien, go ahead.
I was going to say that just hit the nail on the head. People buy these tools. They think they're a one-stop shop. I buy this tool, I set it up, I'm safe. No, not one tool is going to be 100%. Protection and security is a sliding scale. You have to keep monitoring. You have to keep adapting as your threat landscape changes. But it also has to be ring security. So you have to have multiple rings of security. Not just the gate, but everything's got to shrink in. And the closer you get to your more valued assets, the tighter your security has to be.
And it's interesting too. If I can just jump in quickly,
Please.
another threat vector that compounds the problem is what we call injection attacks, right? So you can control what's coming in at the front door. You can have real people. You've verified them. You've got them all the way through this process. You've incorporated them in the system, and then you have either it can be during that process where you're onboarding or verifying somebody, or it can even be through your own back end where you inject bad data, a deepfake, a synthetic identity, cryptographic signals into the system itself, and then that allows the fraudsters to get in. So it's as I said, it's everywhere all the time. Everything everywhere all the time. You can't let up, and you can't believe that this is a problem to be solved.
Let me just say, I warned everybody this was going to be the most enthusiastic panel and webinar we've ever done, and I truly appreciate our panelists for this. Nick, you said something earlier that speaks to me, speaks to the American Fintech Council, speaks to our mission, the concept of setting a standard, right? And we were talking about, you said it from the regulatory perspective, but I'm going to kind of turn it around, and I already know your answer, but I'm going to ask you the question anyway, right? We all kind of wait for tell me what the rule is, and then I'll figure out how to comply. I would argue, and I think AFC often argues, it's the opposite, right? Industry should be setting the standard on their own. How much of that do you see, obviously outside of the work you see when you're working with us, right? But like, how much of that do you see from your clients who are thinking about best practice from the day they start their program, right? Or thinking about how are we setting the standard so the regulator can learn from us and take our work and give it to other people. And I think that's a mentality, but how much are you actually seeing that today, and how much do you encourage for people to be taking kind of that attitude?
That is 100% the right approach, particularly in the environment that we're in today, where the technology and threats are evolving at such a rapid pace that by the time you hear about a technique that's available to you, candidly, like it may be outdated. So we do encourage our clients to really take it upon themselves to not solely do what the regulators have described or what they are hearing the industry is taking part in, but to think about for their own systems and operations, where are those weak points and are there things that they can do to try to shore them up? There can be challenges, candidly, though, as you start to do that, because there can start to become friction between various regulatory regimes. So where we see that often is fraud prevention and privacy, right? For fraud prevention, deepfake prevention, it is super helpful to have tons of signals about people and understand who they are and where they've been on the internet. On the privacy side, we have a lot of opportunities for people to opt out and really be able to obscure their identity for various purposes. And so we oftentimes do have to have conversations with companies too about thinking about balancing those risks. Do we push some of the ambiguity and gray area in what we're doing, maybe for tracking online signals solely for fraud prevention purposes, understanding that at times there are other regimes that might not love that idea. But you're 100% correct. If you wait for a regulator to tell you what they expect, like you're probably going to be breached by then, and it's not going to be the right approach. So the more that you can do proactively and really try to innovate within your own organization and have those conversations with peers about what they're doing, the better you're going to be on and being able to be as on top of this as you can be.
Damien, I guess maybe I'll ask you a similar question, but just a bit differently, right? How do companies outside of making sure everybody here is reaching out to each of you, right? Ulrich to Kaufman and obviously to Maxine in many ways. Damien, what are some of the tools people can think about more than just, as someone mentioned, buy this software, buy this product off the shelf and you're safe? How else should people be thinking about how they're protecting themselves, their institutions, either as a business or on the customer side? Maybe give us both those perspectives.
I am a big fan of all of these events. When I speak at these events, the first thing I thank everybody for being there because I truly do thank them for being there. But I will tell everybody, get out and go to as many of these events as possible because what you haven't seen yet doesn't mean that one of your competitors hasn't seen it yet. Maybe they're going through it and they could be your best ally. So it's all about information sharing. You could buy the best widget in the world. Will it actually do what it's promised? Probably not. We see that all the time. Going back to what Nick just said, everybody's situation is unique. It's a sliding scale. You're either going to have the Wild West and everybody's happy and they can do whatever they want, or you can lock everything down and nothing gets accomplished. You've got to figure out what your appetite for risk is, and then you build your program around that. I'm not putting anybody's tools down or anything like that, but I still think it falls on the end user to have good cyber hygiene, train their people, get them out there into the public talking to see what's going on. Just because you haven't seen it doesn't mean somebody else hasn't gone through it. And just share information. I think that's huge, sharing information.
Maxine, I'm coming to you next because that's a great plug for coming up and showing up to obviously
Exactly.
the Deepfake Summit. But like
Thank you for that.
Damien, I say the same thing when I'm up on stage and I'm talking about government engagement, right? So what Nick said, like engage your regulators, understand sort of what their concerns are, but always be front leaning. I always put a disclaimer saying that those who are in the room are already part of the solution, right? The biggest challenge we have is those who are not in the room, right? Like those are the ones who haven't even taken the time to say, hey, I want to understand what my threat is. Even before I could solve it, I need to know what my problem is. Maxine, you set out to solve for this problem, right? Like you built something that literally is working to
Yeah,
solve
although
that.
I gotta say, like in a way, the Deepfake Summit is really for the people who already have some understanding they have a problem. Like this really, it's really not like a beginner's thing. Like, let us tell you what deepfakes are. It's really about pulling people together from across, again, the ecosystem, government, public, private sector, regulators, policy wonks, technologists, testing people, and putting them all together in a room and saying, okay, we all get we have this problem. Here's where the threats are. Because I talk to people all the time and no one says they have the answer. How do we build a trust infrastructure? How do we actually collaborate together? And really what I'm trying to do is to build those connections and to come up with some kind of consensus. It's a very interactive day. It's not like a PowerPoint conference. It's really breaking down the barrier between the audience and the people on the stage, because everybody in the room is an expert, and really creating a day-long conversation that builds on itself to try to create some consensus about what steps we need to take, and have all those people go back to their bubbles, their regulatory bubble, their private sector bubble, their privacy bubble, their testing bubble, their market development bubble, whatever it is, and take those ideas and those concepts so we can actually feed some consensus out in the marketplace and trying to build together. And one of the foundational ideas that actually came out of some work we did in the Prism Project reports, which are free to download, by the way, if you're interested, is this concept of what we call resilient trust. And the idea behind resilient trust is that it grew out of two reports we did during 2025, which was one report on privacy and compliance and one report on deepfakes and synthetic identities. And what we came up with is these are, not really in opposition. If you really want to build a trust ecosystem, those two things need to be integrated together. We need to think about them, the resilience, the detecting, mitigating, and defending against deepfakes and synthetic identity and agentic AI, and the privacy and compliance piece as being two sides of the same thing. And we need to start building technology that actually has those core principles integrated into it. And so it's these are the kind of ideas that that I've been involved with, kind of propagating through the industry for a long time. And it's something that I think is really important, is we need to stop thinking about those things as being in opposition and thinking about how they're integrated and how they represent an innovative approach to ecosystem building that we haven't begun yet.
Nick, firstly, I love that. Nick, let me ask you a question. Obviously, if someone is picking up the phone or reaching out to you, there is some recognition there's a problem. Whether they know how deep that problem is rooted and whether they can solve for it is one thing. But I would argue you've seen things sort of work from beginning to end, right? You've talked to a client from the very beginning when they engaged you to when you probably use them as an example, as a company that's embraced, various technologies, that have built the systems and the infrastructure. Talk to me about that evolution from a company who's done it the right way, and what your recommendation would be for others who are thinking about this.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one of the things I love most about my job is I do get to be there for most of the journey. And candidly, I get to be there on both sides, right? When they do think about it from the beginning, but things actually do go wrong, and trying to help them get through what that ultimately looks like and what their obligations are, to when things go right. And we hear about, a particular deep threat, like phishing campaign that they caught and they were able to stop. What I find is that when things go right, for the most part, what happens is there's an actual real investment from multiple layers within the organization. It can't just be the technical team. It can't just be the legal team. There has to be a real coordinated effort to work together to make sure, like I had talked about earlier, right, understanding where these risks come from, sort of mapping where the real entry points are, and working together as a team to figure out ultimately where things stand. One of the things I'll actually echo that Damien said, a lot of times when we see companies having outcomes that work really well, it's because they have tabletopped a lot of these issues. Mm-hmm. The likelihood that you can actually prevent every single one of these attacks is so incredibly low that the ability to just put up like an iron wall that just prevents everything is not usually an achievable outcome. But when you have people that have worked together to put in place these mechanisms designed to prevent as much as you can, and you have tabletopped and worked together, what happens when it goes wrong? There can still be events, but we have the right tools to be able to deal with them and get outcomes that are better for the organization that people generally feel good about.
I don't know who came up with this. I think cyber hygiene. I love that. I absolutely love it. Everybody should practice, sort of safe cyber activity and have a good cyber hygiene. Damien, again, you've also, you see sort of various aspects and you step into some of these challenges, sort of various aspects of the problem. Is there one solution, right? If you had to say, hey, one piece of advice that you can offer someone in terms of how they think about deep fakes and cyber risks, what would that be? How do you think about that in terms of how you guide your clients?
I've been thinking about this ever since Nick started talking, and I'm like, I got to follow up with what Nick just said. I don't think you could stop or prepare for everything. So be prepared that it's gonna happen. It's not the person that gets breached or has an issue. It's the person of how they respond to it and how quickly they can overcome it. My best thing that I will tell everybody, other than tabletops, I love them because you can work through problems, but you should be going back to your individual organizations. You should be looking as a team and thinking through scenarios, ransomware, and all these different attacks, and who would you want in that room? So that depending on what happens, you spin up a war room, you have everybody there, you're all working on it at the same time. And this way you can cut down the amount of time, or oh, do we even know who's supposed to be in the room? You have all the brain trust in the room to deal with the problem, and you don't waste valuable time. Just like incident response retainer agreement. I think those are great because you don't want to waste 3, 4 days going through legal. You should have all that stuff in place so you know who you're going to contact, just like with your war room. You know who's supposed to be there, and everybody has their job, and you work through it.
Let me just once again, I want to thank you for this very lively conversation. Each of you bring a unique insight and expertise to the subject of the deep fake threats. Again, thank you very, very much. My name is Phil Goldfeder, the American Fintech Council. So excited that you're able to join us today. Look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thanks, everybody.